Yes.
Yeah, about the possibility of an alternative path of development in Russia. This was, of course, the way the populists argued. That Marxism was valid for the West, but the ancient Russian peasant commune, the Mir, could provide the basis for direct passage to socialism. And at one point, Marx seems to suggest that he also agrees with agrees that this is possible.
Right.
But this is the treatment that I've seen of this. I mean, I also read Marx's letters to Patton and so forth. Who was a populist conspirator. But the main treatment that I've seen of this is by Perry Anderson, which is not very sympathetic. He says that Marx had a blind spot when it came to Russia, due to the fact that they intervened against the revolution of 1848, and that this sympathy for populism was something which Engels later had to correct, to the effect that indeed a stage of capitalist development was necessary for Russia, and this, of course, was very important to Russian Marxism at its founding, its battle against the populists. So, how would you respond to that?
Well, I mean, I think I'm more familiar with the debate from the other end because I know about Perry Anderson's stuff, but in the U.S., there was this book that came out about 25 years ago, Marx and the Russian Road, edited by Theodore Shanin with Monthly Review Press. I think a number of people in the room probably are aware of that. That book almost makes Marx into a left populist. So there's that argument that's been out there as well. So let me just deal with both of those quickly. Perry Anderson, he is unhappy with what Marx says about Russia. He's unhappy with the notion of the Asiatic mode of production, which he says we should lay to rest. And he states, what is that? The first passages to modernity, what is that?
It's the interest of the absolute state.
Yeah, he says in there that fortunately Marx doesn't refer to the Asiatic mode of production in Capital, that he drops it by that time. But that's not true. Right in the fetishism section of Chapter 1 of Capital, it's right there. He also he dislikes Marx's attitude toward Russia, both at the beginning, where Marx thinks of Russia kind of the way Latin American revolutionaries think of the American CIA. I mean, Russia is just, as you remember, the counter-revolutionary power par excellence. It's trying everywhere, even outside its borders, to undermine the revolutionaries. When one of his articles isn't published in the Tribune, he sometimes thinks that Russian agents have bribed them to not publish it, especially if it's a critique of Russia. He accuses British politicians, prominent ones, of being in the pay of Russia. It gets rather overblown, and Perry Anderson is correct to call these writings overblown. Later on, when he shifts his attitude toward Russia, it becomes this sympathy for the villager and this village-based resistance. But I want to say that there's a difference with populism also. It isn't a left populism for a couple reasons. First of all, the populists tend to romanticize the village. Marx is not interested in preserving the village. He sees it as a locus of resistance, but he wants the village to be modernized, but just not under the coercive form of Western capitalism. Secondly, and more importantly, I think it's a clearer difference, the populists believe in autarky. They, like the Maoists later, thought that you could construct socialism in Russia, or Stalin later. In other words, in other words, Marx is very clear that he doesn't, a poor agricultural country like Russia, he doesn't think can develop socialism. He says that can be the starting point for a communist development, resistance based on those communal forms, if it links up with the working class movement in the developed countries. He's not interested in Russia breaking off and by itself becoming what the populist version of socialism is. I don't see any evidence of that in his writings.
Yes.
Does that include his letter of 1878? Does that include his letter of 1878?
Tell us more about
Have you read the letter?
which letter you're talking about.
Well,
The 1877 letter?
That might be the year. I thought it was 1878.
The-
Where he says the forces most ripe for revolution in the world are the Russian peasants.
Right. He says that kind of
And
thing
he-
frequently.
But that was a distinct response to the accusation that he was waiting for industrial global revolution.
Right.
The
Yeah, I talked about
proletariat.
right. That was a letter I talked about before, where he denies that he has a general historical philosophical theory for all countries and all times. But no, he doesn't there. He says that if Russia allows itself to follow, I think it's a quote. This quote is almost exactly this. If Russia allows itself to be drawn in to the net of Western capitalism, it will lose the finest chance ever offered by a people, something like that. But he isn't saying that, there's nowhere that he says they're going to do it on their own. He wants them to resist capital, but he's an internationalist. I don't think he thought the Irish either have a much more developed economy. He's not talking about them breaking off on their own, being able to set up socialism in any kind of positive sense. Because don't forget, from the earliest days, like in the manuscripts of 1844, there's that critique of crude communism, which he says is just leveling down to the bare minimum, a type of equality that is a leveling down, poverty for everyone being a worker, an industrial worker. He's consistently in his work antagonistic to that type of notion. But this is a hotly contested territory, and we could have a whole evening just on Marx's writings on Russia and the various permutations of that. And Perry Anderson has a different view. This guy Theodor Shanin. If you want a view that kind of thinks more in terms of Russia going on its own, this book I mentioned before, Marx and the Russian Road, you can get a view a little bit different from what I've been arguing.
You just have to be careful that the developments in the Soviet Union after that point have been used by many leftists to negate the existence of socialism. Negate the fact that there was no capital accumulation for 70 years. And that's what Marx criticised in his writings. That the peasants had an opportunity to begin negating the existence of capital accumulation and private property existence.
Right.
Even in their primitive state.
What the Russian, by Lenin's generation, they were partly aware of these writings, and frankly they rejected them. But what they said, and Rosa Luxemburg was the only one who said it the one who said it the most explicitly, was things have changed so much that we can't hold to Marx's old positions. That's how they. But they were Rosa Luxemburg, Lenin, Trotsky. These people were much more uncritical modernists than Marx himself was.
Yes. Well, hi. Two quick things. One being, just a little bit more. I think you mentioned that some of his notebook writings on different struggles in what we would call now the developing world. When that will come out, or a little bit about that project.
Yeah.
Two, I'm not wording this very well probably, but with what, particularly saying with China or how things played out, it seems to me, without having as much of an understanding as you obviously, but in regards to where revolutions actually happened under the name of at least Marxism, have been in places where it seems to me that it's been where capitalism has had its sort of weakest link. And so I'm curious about, as much as I would want to uphold Marx, at the same time, is it actually true? Has it happened why hasn't it happened where there could be the link up with the working class in the developed countries? Because it doesn't seem like it's happened. It doesn't mean that therefore that's wrong, but I'm curious about when one's faced with a situation where you have socialist revolutionaries or Marxists and they're able to make a revolution in a country that's largely, or a place, let's say, that is under development, what do they do and how do they, I mean, I know that's been the major debate, but like, is it always just one way or the other, or is there some type of way of bridging that?
Yeah, okay, the first question, the bibliographic question, some of these writings are in English right now. There's a book, The Asiatic Mode of Production by Lawrence Crater, in its appendix. You can find some of these writings on India and also Algeria, which I didn't talk about, these late notebooks. There's a book called The Ethnological Notebooks of Karl Marx, which was published 25 or so years ago. That's in a mixture of German and English. For over 10 years, Professor David Smith has been readying a translation of that, but it's been a very slow process. That's supposed to come out one of these days from Yale University Press. I'm involved in a project to publish a bunch more, some of that stuff, to republish some of that stuff in a better way, and also publish some additional stuff. At the end of his life, he was actually looking at 3 pre-capitalist societies in great detail. Ancient Rome, he wrote a lot about. India, and Russia. And what he's looking at, I think, in each of these, is what the form of the transition is going to be, and does it really have to take the same form? And in that letter of 1877 we were talking about before, there's a very interesting sentence. He says, well, a lot of people think that Russia will therefore go the same way, but look at ancient Rome. They urbanized, they expropriated their peasantry, they replaced that by slave labor, and they drove them into the cities to become a proletariat. But there was no revolution, because the proletarians couldn't, and he doesn't develop all this here, but in the other notebooks he develops, the proletarians couldn't, they were the bread and circuses people, and the slaves were doing the real work. And then this is what I found really interesting. In his notebooks he says, like the poor whites of the South, he says the poor whites, these Roman proletarians. So he's making that connection with race. Now, okay, so that takes us to the other question. There's a lot of reasons that we could talk about why that didn't happen, and the working class and radical movements of the West were again and again unsuccessful, although again it was contingent. I mean, at the end of World War I, in places like Germany and Italy, I mean, it got pretty close. In '68, in a number of countries it got close. We're coming into a huge crisis right now. Initially, sentiment seems to be more to the right than to the left, but it doesn't mean that would be permanent. And I think what I'm interested in is the ideological barrier, viewing established Marxism a little bit as an ideology. I mean, clearly in the Soviet Union it was an ideology, but even, in other words, Marxism, which I think is the most interesting and valid an accurate portrayal of capitalism and of the pathway towards socialism, they haven't grasped this side of Marx and Marxism. And it's not only, I mean, there are others besides Marx. I mean, Engels has some very good stuff on some of these questions, not all of them. Lenin, I wrote a book on Lenin, and one of the chapters in there is on the colonial and national questions and so on. So there is a tradition there, but it's not the dominant tradition. And I think with the eyes of the 21st century, I think with any thinker who's worth reading, not just as a classic, but as a thinker that maybe is valid, we have to re-examine them. If they're a really important thinker, we should be able to reread them and grasp things that we hadn't grasped before based on the times that we're living in. I mean, how many people in the 18th century were looking at the discussion of women's equality, Plato's Republic, where he said that women could do everything, including becoming generals? I don't think that in the Catholic universities or the British public schools that they were emphasizing that part of Plato when there weren't even any women around as part of the discussion.